Hi, everybody. It's great to be with you. I'm glad that happened at the beginning of today rather than halfway through. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and I hope you're going to enjoy the next hour of some discussion and illustration as to the new RSL Classical Piano Syllabus. So just to introduce you really to what we're going to be doing today. Um, First and foremost, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the syllabus itself, and I'm going to be going through the different component parts of the examination. One of the very useful things about the RSL Classical exam is the way in which each of the components are designed. Each part of the exam has really been designed with care. And for me as a teacher, there are certain things in it which are really, really appealing. One of those things is actually the design of what we would call the supporting tests. So the sight reading and the ear tests, and the other associated things like that. There is a lot of detail in this particular syllabus, which really does help teachers and students to make sure that they are really properly prepared. And I'm also going to give you some demonstrations. I'm going to show you a few of the tests. We're going to go through maybe a couple of the pieces. I'm just going to take you through the syllabus bit by bit. Connor, if it's possible, could you please pin my screen just so as I can see the, in fact, I think I can do it. There we go. Right, I've pressed the button, that's fine. So to begin with then, I'm going to really introduce you to the two types of RSL Classical Piano exam. Now, it's worth saying right at the beginning that one of the great things about these exams is that there are two separate pathways. They're very, very different, but they are at the same level of assessment. The first pathway is what I would call the traditional grade exam. And this is where we have an exam of different component parts. There are 5 different parts in what I call a graded exam. We have technical work, which are things such as scales, arpeggios, or broken chords. I'll take you through those in just a moment. We also have pieces. Now, in a graded exam, you'd be expected to play 3 pieces in your exam, just like many other exam boards out there. There's also sight reading. We have ear tests, and also general musicianship questions. And these are a series of short questions which are right at the end of the exam, and they are designed to explore a candidate's understanding of the music and also their instrument, which is really, really important. And today, I've got an opportunity to show you exactly what those questions will be like. It's also worth pointing out that there is actually a additional component, a 6th and optional component, and it's really important to stress this is optional. If you have students that love grade exams, but for whatever reason they don't want to present sight reading for their examination, as an alternative, they can do what we call the contemporary interpretation or improvisation exercise. So this is an alternative to sight reading. It's optional, and I can show you how that works today. So that's the first pathway of an RSL classical piano exam. And it's fair to say that this is a very, very popular structure, of course, but it's not the only structure. And I'm quite sure as teachers that we have students that love the piano, they love repertoire. They seem to, go through it very, very quickly. They just consume lots of different styles of music. But for whatever reason, they don't want to present ear tests and sight reading and musicianship questions or technical work for an examination. It doesn't mean that's not part of their normal curriculum. It just means for an examination, they don't choose to do that. And this is where the second option is really useful in RSL Classical Piano, because what we can do instead is a performance certificate. And this is where we have 5 pieces, and they are of equal weighting, and that's all there is in a performance certificate exam. So as you can see, very, very different layout, a very, very different structure, which I think appeals really, really nicely to certain groups of students. I've had students that have done performance exams and really, really enjoyed them. It's also worth saying for a performance certificate that 3 of the 5 pieces can actually be the student's own choice. Of course, we've got a wide selection of pieces in the new grade books, but if your student wishes to, they can choose up to 3 pieces completely from their own preference. It doesn't have to be an RSL graded piece. Now, in the past, own choice pieces have been great for students, but for teachers, there is sometimes a little bit of anxiety attached to it, because there's always that worry, isn't there, that the piece that you choose when presented to an examiner may not be agreed to be the correct level. Now, RSL have thought quite a lot about that, and actually, as part of the exam service, we do offer an approval scheme. And that basically means that if you have an own choice piece that you'd like to use, you can send it through to us and we can pre-approve it before the exam. So there's no worrying about whether or not the pieces that the students are going to play are the correct standard. It's all been pre-approved, which I think is fantastic. So there are the 2 different exam pathways. I'm going to go back now to the graded exam system, the pathway where there are 5 different parts. And I'm going to go through each of those parts in turn, just to show you a little bit more detail as to what's involved in each part. Let's talk about technical work first of all. And for this illustration, I've chosen to use the very first level of exam that we have at RSL, which we call debut. You may well, if you've got experience of ABRSM or other exam boards, they obviously use different terminology. So I think for ABRSM, it's initial grade, or it could be pre-prep. It's the level of skill we'd expect students to achieve within the first 12 to 18 months. So let's look at the technical work first of all. And there are 3 parts to the technical work. We have scales, arpeggios, or broken chords, and also a technical study. And I'll show you what the technical study is in just a minute. But let's start off with scales. Now, as a teacher, when you open a graded book, the first thing, of course, you're going to have to look at is what scales are required for that particular exam. And it's worth saying that in contrast to other exam boards, all the technical work that our students are going to be expected to learn for their grade exam is printed in the same book as their pieces. In actual fact, there is only 1 book for each grade exam for RSL Classical Piano. So in each book you have the pieces, you have the scales and all the technical work. You also have examples of sight reading, ear tests, and the optional improvisation exercise. So it's all in one particular book, which is really great, especially for parents, because there's only 1 particular book to purchase. They don't have to buy an extra sight reading book or an extra scales book. It's all self-contained. So here's a list of the scales required for piano debut level. And as you look through those, if, like me, you've got a classical background, some of those will be really familiar, of course, C major, but there's a couple there that you may not have had so much experience with, A natural minor and the pentatonic scales. So which is the best way to introduce those? Well, again, as a teacher, one of the great things that I really love about this syllabus is that all the technical work you'll see in a moment is very, very tightly integrated. It's all connected, and it joins together really nicely. And to show you what I mean, I'm going to go to the piano, and I'm just going to just take you through very briefly the sorts of things that I would be introducing to my students. So let's begin first of all with, of course, very familiar, a C major scale. They're separate hands for debut level. So, okay, very quickly. Oh, I've changed the tuning on my piano. I'm really sorry about that. Let's just reset that. That's the second technical gremlin today. Hopefully that will be the only two we have. And let's try this again. Okay, so a C major scale there. Of course, that's a very straightforward scale to introduce to students. Once they've got that, we could say to them, okay, let's start off from a different note. Let's start on A, but we'll keep the same finger pattern and the same notes. And let's try this, starting on A, going up to A. Now, straight away, we've just introduced an A natural minor scale. We haven't really focused on any notation, although the notation is printed in the books. We could also go one step further. Let's go back to C major and introduce a major pentatonic. We could explain that from a C major scale, let's remove note number 4 and note number 7. So now we have this. And there's our C major pentatonic. Once a student has got that securely and playing that fluently, we could say, okay, remember those notes. Let's try them from A. So we're going to take C, D, E, G, A, but let's change the order. Let's start from A, and we get this. And you can see straight away there that we've covered C major, A natural minor, C major pentatonic, and A minor pentatonic in a very straightforward and hopefully a way that connects all those particular scales together. The student should be able to understand that in actual fact, although they are 4 different scales to learn, they are all connected, of course, by a C major key signature. And that's the great thing about these, is that they are all connected, very, very closely together. In terms of broken chords, the patterns there will be very, very familiar. The nice thing about the RSL Classical exams is that you'll find the tempo is actually printed in the graded books. So there's no sort of ambiguity or anxiety over whether the student is playing quickly or slowly. The tempo is printed. And that's not to say that if a student on the day plays too quickly or too slowly, that it will be unsuccessful. That's not the case at all. The idea is to give you a guiding tempo so you know what we should be aiming for, ideally. So that's scales and broken chords. There is one extra element, though, of the technical work, and it's what we call a technical study. So there is the example that's taken from the debut grade book, printed in the grade book. And for me, the great thing about this is that it's not just a study that's been composed, in isolation. You can see there that there's a really strong link between A minor and C major. The first line, of course, is an A minor exercise, borrowing heavily from the A minor triad in the right hand. We've got some A minor left hand notes, so very, very, relative to the chord. The same thing happens in the second line with C major. And when I'm teaching this to students, a very important part of the teaching process is actually a discussion of what the ingredients of that study are. In other words, I would avoid just showing them what the notation says bar by bar. We've got to relate that. So, for example, the first bar there, we can say, well, okay, what are these three notes in the right hand? They're played staccato. Where do they come from? Well, of course, the answer is an A minor triad. And they should be familiar with an A minor triad because obviously they've already learned A minor for their broken chords and their scales. So you can see there that one of the strengths is that the keys are interrelated between all three parts of the technical work. So a lot of thought gone into that. Hopefully, it will make things much more straightforward and easier for students to understand. Let's move on now to a piece, and I'm going to show you one of the debut pieces. I'm not sure if you've got with you the RSL Classical Piano sample packs, but if you have, this piece will be in the sample pack, and I'm going to play you just what you see on screen there. This is a lovely piece of music by a composer called Jan Tiersen, who is a European film composer. He writes really beautiful, simple music. And although you might look at that and think, well, that's a fairly straightforward piece, it is debut level. It sounds really nice. I'm just going to play you just a small part of this. And so on and so on. So a lovely piece of music there. And actually, for me, this is a really lovely example of the sort of music that I would hope to give a student after perhaps 12 or 18 months. There's a lot there that builds essential skills that if we can get right at debut level, the next few grades will be much more straightforward. We know from research, for example, that after grade 3, there is quite a drop-off globally for piano lessons and piano teaching. After students get to grade 3, there is a sort of drop in numbers. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is that we need to make sure that between debut and grade 3, we give them lots of skill nourishment, if you like. And one of the great things about the choices of pieces here is that there are lots of skills to explore and learn. So the first one for me is maintaining a pulse. And if you have a look at the very first part of the piece, you can see we've got tied, dotted half notes. We've got long notes there. And it's really, really important that from the very beginning of the piece, students are able to internalize and feel a very strong sense of the beat. Otherwise, what you tend to have is a piece of music that sort of has the right notes in it, but obviously loses some shape. So arguably, they were the right notes, but we were missing quite a lot of musical information there. And as well as that, this piece is intended to be quite a soft piece. You can see at the beginning we've got mezzo piano marking and dolce, so to be played sweetly. And actually, for a beginning student to be able to develop what I would call a reliable core tone, so a tone that they play which isn't too loud, but is controlled at lower dynamic levels is really, really important. And they've really got to control every note. They've got to make sure that the melody is shaped nicely. And if we can get that right at debut level with something like this piece, again, it's a fantastic start. As I've already mentioned, there is quite a bit of counting to go on. You can see there that we've got tied notes throughout the piece. And also, if you have a look at the beginning of the second line, we've got tied eighth notes as well. So what I call quaver timing or eighth note timing, a very, very important component of that piece. So let's move on now to sight reading. And it's probably fair to say that if you asked a student, do they like sight reading? The majority of the time, the answer might be negative, which I think is a real shame, because as a musician, sight reading is a very, very important skill. And that's why we've kept it in the RSL Classical grade exam. But as a teacher, there's always an element really of anxiety over sight reading. Yes, you can buy lots of different books with examples in, but there's always an element of, again, anxiety and worry over, are the examples that I give my student in my lessons the same as what they're going to get in their exam? So if we can build confidence from a teacher's point of view, and we can build confidence from a student that they are prepared and ready for the sight reading test, it's in my view, a really big positive. One of the things I like about the sight reading tests in RSL Classical is that they are very, very straightforward, and there's lots of information in the graded books. Here are on screen 2 examples from the graded books. These are the 2 practice sight reading examples that you get contained in the graded book. And there is quite a lot of information that we can glean from those. What's not on the screen is actually an example tempo. So students know exactly how fast this piece should be played. And if they wish, in an examination, they can ask the examiner to provide a sample tempo. So the examiner will play a metronome beat, which will indicate how fast this sight reading exercise should ideally be played. Now, again, just like the scales, it doesn't mean if they play too quickly or too slowly, they'll necessarily be unsuccessful. It's really good, actually, as a teacher to have a guide as to exactly how fast the piece should be played. For debut, grade 1 and grade 2, actually the tempos have been really carefully thought about, and you'll find that actually the emphasis is on correct reading rather than playing quickly. But let's take a look at these 2 excerpts. What information can we glean from these? Well, have you noticed, first of all, that the keys, again, match the technical exercises? So our students are reading in C major and A minor, and hopefully, because they've done their technical work, this will be very, very familiar. And also, have a look at the types of pitch, rhythm, and we've mentioned tempo. With pitch and rhythm, we were very, very careful to make sure that the rhythm, time values, and the relationships of pitch that we used in the example sight reading tests was exactly the same as the tests that students will get in the actual exam. And speaking as someone actually who wrote these tests, I can say with fairly good authority that the details that you see in these practice tests are exactly the same as the details you'll get in the real thing. So, for example, you can obviously observe that the hands aren't playing together. If we take a look at example 1, you can see we've got left hand starting first, right hand starting after that. We also have quarter notes and half notes, crotchets and minims. And also look a little bit more carefully, if you can just about make it out on the screen. You can see there that the notes are actually going step by step. And the melodic range is simply one note below or one note above in all cases. So it does help to actually do a little bit of analysis. Once you've got all those details, and they're all available in the book, you can construct your own. So here's one that I made earlier. This is an example of a test I put together, and you can see it uses there lots of the same rules. We've got half notes and quarter notes. One hand begins after the other, and if you have a look at the melodic range, it's just simply step-by-step notes, one note above or one note below. So for me, RSL have taken a lot of the guesswork out of sight reading, but they've still kept that important skill in there, which I think is fantastic news, and I hope this will be really helpful to teachers and students. So moving on next to ear tests. And just like sight reading, I would imagine that if we asked our students about their experience of ear tests in an exam, it may not always be positive. And again, I think that's a shame because oral perception skills are vital for musicians. But it's fair to say that ear tests probably do vary greatly between exam boards, and also have you noticed how that they vary greatly from grade to grade? So we thought very carefully about this, and we've come up with some solutions to avoid some of the common complaints that we get from students, such as the tests didn't seem the same as the practice ones. Yeah, well, I guess that's a fair observation in cases, of course, because a lot of ear tests are based on musical examples, which, of course, have to be different to the practice tests that you get in the book. The music is going to be different. I didn't understand what the examiner asked me. Well, yes, of course, if you think about ear tests, traditionally, they've always been heavily reliant on questioning from the examiner. And sometimes this will use quite specific musical language, which is okay in most examples. But let's imagine, for example, that we're doing a debut or grade 1 or even grade 2, and our student is perhaps fairly young. That it may be a situation where they misunderstand or mishear the examiner, or they're not sure what the examiner said, and they don't feel able to ask for the question to be repeated. And therefore, of course, the test is compromised, which is a shame because actually we haven't got as far as thinking about any music. The tests were too fast. Yeah, I guess if an examiner delivers the oral test with enthusiasm, then it could be the case that the examiner misses some important details. And also, quite a common complaint with some of my students, I don't like singing. Well, that's a shame because, of course, a lot of exam boards still use singing as an indicator of oral perception. And I remember when I was going through ABRSM grades about 20 years ago, in fact, probably more like 30 years ago, it was heavily reliant on singing. And to be fair, it's changed slightly, but they still have sight singing exercises in the oral tests in a fairly low to mid grades. So if students are not happy with singing for whatever reason, that can also be a source of anxiety. So how do we do it then in RSL Classical Piano? Well, there is actually only one test, which we call melodic recall. And it's a test where we ask our students to play their instrument. They don't have to sing. And in actual fact, the playing doesn't really start until grade 2 and above. So in other words, the melodic recall test is slightly different for debut and grade 1. I will show you an example of debut and also a little bit later on some other tests. It's worth saying that the test is fully described in the grade book. Again, there's lots of details in the book and also in the syllabus, which as teachers gives us lots of clues as to exactly how to prepare our students. And I'll show you what that means in just a moment. Because there's lots of detail, hopefully it's much easier to give practice examples which will be exactly the same as the real thing on the day of the exam. And another important point to make here is that although there is an examiner in the room, they will not take part in the oral tests, in the ear tests, except just to switch on some equipment. In other words, the ear tests are actually given from a recorded track, a recorded excerpt. Now, why do we do that if there's a real live musician in the room with our candidate? Well, because it goes back to the point on making sure that the assessments are consistent. We want to try and ensure that grade 1 ear tests given in London are exactly the same thing as grade 1 ear tests given in Singapore, for example. And how do we ensure that? Well, we put all the tests on a recording, which we can then distribute worldwide and ensure that everybody has exactly the same ear tests, which I think is fantastic news. So let's move on to a couple of demonstrations. I'm going to show you, first of all, how we would do a debut oral test, ear test. And because I rebooted and turned off my piano, I now have to go into a little bit of technical setup, which hopefully won't take me very long at all. So we'll just connect my iPad to my piano. There we go. And I'm going to show you what we would do for a demonstration. So first of all, let's just talk about what we would do for a debut ear test. Now, in the syllabus, it says that this test will consist of 2 notes, and the syllabus and the graded book tells us the first note will be C, so we know the test will begin on a C. There we go. And then the candidate will hear 2 notes. And they have to give a response which is either higher or lower. So they have to judge whether the second note they heard there was higher or lower. And of course, in that example, it would be higher. Now, for grade 1, we use the same test. Again, the syllabus tells us the first note is going to be a C. And then candidates would hear 3 notes this time. So the test would sound like this. And their answer would be lower and lower, because the second note was lower than the first one, and the third note was lower than the second one. So it's literally just 3 notes. And that's how the ear test works at debut and grade 1. It's very, very straightforward. And the good thing about that is that the student only has to respond with 1 word, either higher or lower. That's all the detail that they need to give. As I mentioned earlier, grade 2 is a little bit different. And before I show you a grade 2 example, I did mention earlier that there was a lot of information in the graded book and the syllabus to help us as teachers produce practice examples. So what sort of information is in the book? Well, let me show you. I've got a little table here. I've actually produced one for grade 2 and grade 3, but as I'm going to demonstrate grade 2, let's just stay with grade 2. You can see there, first of all, that the test will be at a tempo of 95 beats per minute. It will consist only of half beats or minims. The time signature will be 4/4. The length of the exercise will be 2 bars long. It's going to be in the key of C major, and the starting note will be C. And the range will only be up a fourth from C. So we know already as teachers lots of information about that test. So hopefully it gives us a lot of confidence in preparing our students. We know the sorts of exercises to devise. Now in the exam, the test is played twice. There's a 10-second gap in the middle, and after the students heard it twice, they then have to play it to a metronome beat. So they hear it twice, they'll then hear a metronome beat begin. After 4 beats, they play. Hear it twice, 4 clicks, play. Very, very straightforward method. And they can practice their answer whilst the track is playing. So let me show you how it works. Let's go back to the piano. And I'm going to play, this is the backing track, well, I beg your pardon, not a backing track at all. This is the ear test track that you can download as part of the graded book. So this is published by RSL, and it gives a really good indication as to the format of the test. Here we go. You'll hear me listen twice, then I'll play. And again, remember it's going to start on a C, and we know it's going to be in C major, and it's going to be 2 bars long. Okay, let's try this. Okay. Okay, that's my 2 playings. Now I have to play after 4 beats. And that's it. So that's the ear test for grade 2. Very, very straightforward, and hopefully it removes a lot of the anxiety over what an ear test is going to be. But obviously we still keep that very, very important skill as part of our exam. Okay, so moving on to the last component, which we called general musical questions, and I've kept this at debut level. So we're going to have a little look at the sorts of questions that a debut student would be expected to answer. There are 2 halves, really. The first half is what we call musical knowledge. And this is where candidates have to identify all of the following 4 points. So they'll have to identify treble and bass stave. They'll have to find a treble and bass clef. The examiner will ask them to point to a specific pitch of note. So the examiner may say, "Can you find me a middle C in the right hand?" And the candidate will point to it. And again, that's a really important thing to say, is that there is very little in the way of discussion or extended response required from the student. All they have to do simply is point, when asked by the examiner, to a particular feature on their score. So, for example, if the examiner says, "Please point to the treble clef," they can point to it. They don't have to explain it in any detail, but they still have to show knowledge, which is really important. So we've got treble and bass staves and treble and bass clefs, note pitch names, and also note values. There you can see that we will expect students to identify and find a minim or a crotchet, for example, in their scores. The second half of the questions is actually a selection. So the examiner will ask for one of the following to be found, and there you can see the topics. We have a black or a white key, or middle C. So the examiner might say, "Can you point to middle C on your piano, please?" Hopefully they'll find a middle C. So again, they need to show the knowledge, but not necessarily talk about it in any great detail. And again, all the topics that students may be asked are listed in the syllabus and also in the graded books. So there'll be no unpleasant surprises on exam day when they come to this particular component. And it's worth saying as well that for this component, there are 5 marks available. So they're the different component parts of a grade exam. And I've got a couple more demonstrations to show you today. Before I do, I'm going to go back to technical work very briefly, and I'm not going to go into as much detail, but I just wanted to show you very quickly as to what the next stage would be. So if we go up from debut to grade 1, for our technical work, you can now see that we've got 2 different keys. As I mentioned earlier, we've got F major and G major, so one key with 1 flat, 1 key with 1 sharp, and the related minor keys as well. So again, a very strong connection there between F major and D minor, and separately G major and E minor. There's a very good correlation between those. And of course, then you'd expect F major and G major to feature in the technical study, but also in the sight reading as well. And also in the optional improvisation test, which I'm going to show you in just a second. It's worth saying a very quick point about minor keys. You remember in debut, we just asked for natural minor. Now for grade 1 and beyond, if students like preparing natural minors, they are quite straightforward to learn, then they can do. However, if you would wish to teach harmonic or melodic minors instead, that's perfectly fine, and you can. All of those 3 flavors of minor scale are absolutely fine. The only thing is that you have to stick to one. You have to stick to one choice throughout the whole exam. You can't you can't mix a melodic minor with a harmonic minor. It's got to be one of the 3 different types for all the scales that the candidate will be asked and that they need to prepare. And they need to tell the examiner before the exam begins as to which type of a minor scale they've learnt. Don't worry about how we do that. There are systems in place that they can record their choice with no worries whatsoever. So I've introduced you to grade 1 technical work because I want you to think about those 2 keys, F major and G major. And let's move on to, actually, we'll come back to this in just a moment, another piece. I wanted to show you this. I'll just take away my little screen here. You can probably see there we go, the full version. Now, this is the optional improvisation and interpretation test. This is taken from grade 1. Again, notice how it's in the key of F major. Now, this is an alternative to sight reading. It's optional, and you may well find that you get some students that really love this. The sort of student maybe that comes into their lesson and starts to sort of mess around with melodies and chords and things completely unprompted. If they're really creative with making their own melodies or finding some nice chords that they like to play, then this test may well be really appealing for them. So the idea is that as a student, you would read, obviously, those 4 bars. They're blank. There's no melody written. All we have is some chord symbols over the top. So what do you have to do for this? Well, for grade 1, you have an option. You can, if you wish, just play the chords. So you can, find an F chord, and we can find a B flat chord, and we can find a C chord, and a B flat chord. If I put that back on the screen, that's what we had there. That's what we were following. An F chord, B flat chord, a C chord, and back to B flat again. So students can choose just to play that if they like, if they were able to perhaps vary that pattern. So perhaps if they could introduce a little bit more rhythmic interest, for example, maybe playing, it's not going to be complicated, just maybe playing on beats 1 and 3. So if they did 2, 3, 4, that sort of thing, that would be absolutely fine, very, very acceptable. Or they could choose as an alternative to not play chords, but to play a melody in their right hand. So again, following the same chords that we have there, we could, simply do a very, very simple melody. And so on and so on. And in actual fact, I'm going to show you how that would work in just a moment. And as I've already said, the keys match the technical work, which is great. Hopefully by now they should be familiar with F major. And don't forget, they probably have learnt the F major triad, B flat triad, and C triad in their technical work as well. They have 90 seconds to prepare it. So once they see it, they have a minute and a half to have a look at the chords and to start to work out what they want to do. After that, the test will begin. And it's in a similar way to the ear test, it's done with a recorded track. Now, for the improvisation, the recorded track is actually a fully arranged backing track. It sounds fantastic, and it's great fun to do. I'll show you in a second. So the idea is that the students would play along to that. And why do we use a backing track? Well, because it sounds much, much nicer. It's more supportive. The student feels like they're actually taking part in an ensemble rather than being exposed. And also, it's a great way to encourage a secure pulse once again. And as I said, it's with the backing track. And also, the format used in the book is the same as in the exam. So you can be really confident that the chords that you see in this example will be exactly the same chords that you find in the exam copy, the one that the students will do on the day. There'll be, no unpleasant surprises in terms of a new chord. It's already been pre-prepared using the resources in the graded book. So let's have a go at a grade 2 improvisation test. I'm going to show you how straightforward these are. So don't forget, the way we're going to do this is there'll be 90 seconds. Let's assume I've had a 90-second preparation time. I'm now ready to play. This example will be played a total of 2 separate times. The first time I can practice. The second time the examiner will assess my playing. So the assessment is on the second playing. Let's try this. And again, I'm using the example from the grade 1 book. It's the same example that you saw there on screen. I'm going to choose to just do a very simple melody like this. Okay, that would be fine, but it's not assessed until the second time. Here we go. And that's it. That's all there is to that particular test. And as I said, it is an optional test. You do not have to do this. You can instead do sight reading. But certainly for some students, that test is really, really exciting, particularly if they like creating their own things. I flicked through very quickly a couple of slides ago another piece, and we've got some time just to show you a grade 1 piece. This is actually quite I would say an English piece, I guess. It's written by an English composer, Gustav Holst. This piece is often played actually at rugby matches, um, and obviously the home of RSL is in Twickenham in London, in United Kingdom, which is the home of English rugby as well. I'm sure that's not the reason why they chose this piece, but it's often used as a rugby football song. But originally, it was written as part of the Planets Suite. As a piano arrangement, this piano arrangement is a fantastic arrangement. It's grade 1. And again, it builds on a lot of the skills that we did at debut. Notice, first and foremost, how the key signature again reflects the technical work. We've got 1 flat here. Let's just give you a little flavor as to how to play how I play this particular piece. And so on and so on. It's a lovely piece of music, and again, some important skills there. We've got legato playing, and something that hopefully we started off with at debut level. You can see we've got some ledger lines creeping in there, so some opportunities to talk to students about music above and below the stave. And also, again, balancing of the hands in terms of which hand has the melody, how do we project that over the left hand, and why is that important? And in general, just shaping that piece of music. How do we create something which, even at grade 1 is musically satisfying? It's a lovely arrangement. So we are coming up to the last sort of 5 minutes, and I've been through pretty much all aspects of what I'd like to show you today. However, let's just flip through this. When we did a similar webinar last week to teachers in China, there were lots of questions. So I'm quite sure it may be the similar case today. So whilst you're thinking of your question, one of the questions we do get asked quite a lot is, are RSL classical piano grades regarded as similar standard to others? And the answer is yes, most definitely. The RSL Classical Awards are monitored and approved by the UK education authorities. People such as Ofqual, for example, who regulate all piano exams, music exams in the UK. They rate RSL classical exams exactly the same level as ABRSM, Trinity, etc., etc. And UK universities also recognize RSL qualifications as a means of entry into a UK university. That may not necessarily, of course, be a pathway for all of our students, but it just demonstrates the academic quality of what we're doing here. I can see lots of questions. My goodness me. Okay, let's see if we can go through them. Which exams, Elaine is asking, which exams are easier for the student, the RSL or the ABRSM? Well, that's a very interesting question, Elaine. I would say that I think one of the points that I was trying to make today was that I would say the RSL exams are certainly more straightforward. We've talked about the details of the sight reading and the scales, and how the scales all relate to each other, and how the scales relate to the pieces. And as someone who teaches RSL Classical, and also have students who are still on ABRSM, to have the RSL approach whereby all those aspects are connected is really, really useful. And I have seen with my RSL students that they become much more aware of keys, uh, elements of music theory, you know, because they're having to learn technical studies and think a little bit more about keys, that does help them. So of course, we've all got our opinions as to, which exam board is best in terms of is it easy for our students. But I would say that it's really, really great to have very clear information about all those supporting tests with RSL. Goodness me, lots of questions. Where can we find or learn? Michelle is asking, where can we find or learn improvisation chords? It sounds interesting. Any website to refer to? Yes, I would. Michelle, your first port of call would be the RSL Awards website. Obviously, I've only given you a very short bit of information about the improvisation test. And again, I would direct you first and foremost to the RSL website. There are lots of resources on there, links to YouTube videos and tutorials about, how to take the first few steps with improvisation. I have to also say that's something that is being planned in the future. So more resources will be forthcoming, but there is already lots there. Are all backing tracks for improvisation section reggae style? Says Toma. No, they're not. They are contemporary, though. It's fair to say that all the backing tracks are contemporary, which is why actually the full name of the test. Connor will correct me on this if I'm wrong. I seem to remember that it's something like contemporary interpretation or improvisation. So it is true to say that all the backing tracks for the improvisation tests are contemporary, but they're not all reggae. But I think the fact that they're contemporary is fantastic because actually, for most students, it's energizing and it's lively, and also it's quite nice to have a balance between those tracks and the more classical music that they'll be studying as their pieces. For advanced level higher grades, is it important to do the repeats? The piece will end up longer, which can be quite a bit of practice for stamina, even though the repeats are exactly the same. Okay, that's from an anonymous one, but that's a good question. So to do with repeats, do you have to play repeats? The answer is no. You don't have to play repeats. If you are required to do repeat, the piece will say specifically, it will say very clearly repeats are required. From memory, I can't think of any pieces that do ask for that, but there could be some in there. But no, repeats are optional. As you say, repeats can drain stamina, and also in an examination situation, they can take up a lot of extra time. So, I think it's fair to say that repeats are optional. Okay, that's those.
Chris, we have quite a few in the chat as well
We do, yes. Thanks, Connor. I've just found those. Yeah, I think one of the things here is a strong demand for improvisation and teaching it. I have to say that's something that we are very keen on supporting at RSL. As I said, there are resources available on the website, but hopefully you've seen here how, with a little bit of training, you can go straight into it. And we certainly have some things planned for the future. Students have a problem to follow the beat on the backing track. How to get them started? Yes, this is really, really good. If you've ever said to, as teachers, we often think that playing with a metronome, for example, is really, really easy. But actually, it's a skill that we've developed as musicians. I remember one of my colleagues as a drummer saying, if I'm playing to a metronome and I can hear the click, I'm doing it wrong. What does he mean by that? Well, he actually meant that, of course, that if you can hear the click as you're playing, it often means that the click is either before or after the note. So in other words, you're not entirely playing on the beat. So it's a learnt skill. How do we develop that in our students? Well, the first thing we do is we put the piano away and we just do it with clapping. You can do it with, simply if I start to clap a beat, 1, 2, 3, 4, like this, and then you say, okay, you join in, and we get the student to join in, and then we say, okay, I'm going to do it faster. 1, 2, 3, 4. There it is, and we do it slower. Once they've mastered the change in tempo by clapping, then when we're happy as teachers that they can do that, we then go to the piano. And then we say, okay, I'm going to keep clapping. Can you play, for example, let's do a little bit of a C major scale, 1 note per click. 1, 2, 3, like that. So they are used to playing whilst they hear a pulse being clapped. Now, the important thing is that once they've mastered that, you swap around. So I would then play a C major scale like this, and then I get the student to clap. And then I say, okay, you're in control. You can make me go faster or you can make me go slower. And of course, they find this hilarious. It's great fun. And they play faster and they play, but they clap more slowly. And what we're doing there is hopefully building up skills in measuring pulse and internalizing pulse. So we do the clapping first. We do lots of listening to me clapping, lots of clapping along to scales, clapping along to their pieces, for example. And it's only at that point when they've got that skill developed, then we start to introduce a backing track. Because if you put the backing tracks in too soon, they get so distracted by the sound and also distracted by what they're trying to think about. Remember, they've got to improvise, they've got to think about playing chords or melodies. Then if that sense of inner pulse is not really firmly ingrained, it's going to go, and they're going to miss it. So, I mean, we could spend a whole webinar on this, couldn't we? But hopefully, yes, very briefly, lots of clapping to start with, teacher and student, one-to-one, then eventually find some familiar music that they can clap along to, then swap over. They play the music while you clap the pulse and do it that way. Then introduce unfamiliar music to them as well. So I hope that makes sense and it's a little bit useful. All 3 pieces have a backing track, asks Agnes. No, that's a very important point. I wasn't involved really in the arranging of the music so much, and Connor, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that none of the classical pieces have a backing track. That's very. Is that correct?
That
Good.
is correct.
Okay. Thanks, Connor. And that's an important distinction. You may be familiar, of course, with our rock school contemporary piano and contemporary keys syllabus, where we do use backing tracks for some of our pieces. With RSL Classical Piano, we made a very definite decision not to incorporate backing tracks for classical piano grades because we didn't really feel that classical piano grades had really much relevance to playing along to backing tracks. That's something that I would say is much more contemporary skill. Maybe not used so much for classical musicians, of course, unless you're playing with an orchestra or a concerto as part of an ensemble. But in terms of an assessment for a classical piano exam, we don't use backing tracks at all, except for that optional improvisation exercise. So again, the same question. We don't use backing tracks for the pieces. Okay, so we've talked about improvisation. We've talked about any resources for improvisation. Just having a quick scan through here. Again, Connor, if there's anything there that I've missed. Oh, there's a question about the app I'm using on my iPad. It's an app called Fourscore. I don't work for Fourscore. I'm not sponsored by Fourscore, but it just happens to be that a lot of musician colleagues that I know of, they use it, and I've picked it up. The app itself is spelt for as in FOR, score as in score, musical score. Four scores, one word. Yeah, and it works quite well. Sadly, not available on Android platforms, unfortunately. The best one that I've seen on Android platforms is something called Music Sheets, which is quite good. Has very similar features to Fourscore on the iPad. Okay. One of the nice things I like about Fourscore is you probably noticed I had my music, and I could also queue in audio tracks from the same app, which removes a lot of the sort of multitasking and switching around, which is really, really good. I think we've come to the end of all the questions. Loads of questions. Thank you very much for bringing your question in. I think we've just got some more. How do you import RSL songs to Fourscore? That's a good question. The what I've done here is all my scores are in PDF format, and Fourscore just imports the PDF format. It's basically a PDF reader. A PDF file is a certain type of file, like a JPEG photograph or a Word document or an Excel document. A PDF document is a printed document. It could be a text, it could be a music score. Fourscore will import PDF files, so they are PDF files. Yes, a question on chord symbols. How do you get to know chord symbols like B flat major 9? Okay, well, B flat major 9. That I'm fairly sure we didn't ever put any major 9 chords in. That's a lovely chord, but it's not something I think that we'll expect students to do, perhaps until about grade 7 or grade 8, in actual fact. How do you learn those? Well, again, I think there are lots of resources available on the internet about construction of chords. I'm just trying to think of some pointers, and maybe one of the things we could think about is perhaps some resources on RSL's website about chords. I think there are some resources available already on the pages. Again, Connor will be able to advise as to the best thing we can do there. I'm trying to think if there's any books that I could recommend. Yes, there is. In actual fact, if you'd like to look for an author called Mark Levine, I'll type his name in the chat window. Mark Levine. There we go. The books are up there on my shelf, but Mark Levine has written some jazz piano. He's called Jazz Piano Theory and Jazz Piano. There's another one called Jazz Piano something. Jazz Piano Guide or something. They're very, very good. I have to say they're in a lot of detail. You don't necessarily need to read more than perhaps the first couple of chapters, because what Mark Levine does is he basically takes, for example, if you're talking about an A flat major 9 chord, that sort of thing, he will teach you how to play it as a jazz pianist, like that. We may not necessarily need that much detail, but the theory is all there. It's a good starting place to think about those. Okay, for all our resources and qualifications, they're on the website. Yeah, great. Okay, right. So I hope that's been useful. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you very much for your questions.
Chris, we have one final question of teaching.
Sure.
It's in the question and answer section. If teaching the damper pedal, how would you teach that for the first time?
For the first time, that's a great question. Teaching the damper pedal. It is a really tricky subject, isn't it? And off the top of my head, what would I do? Start simply. That's certainly the main thing, I think. And by simply, I do have a pedal obviously on my piano today, except I didn't put a camera on it. But hopefully you can hear the sort of thing that you might be able to do with it. If you let's try. Sorry, messing around with angles of cameras. We could, for example, take a scale. We could take 5 notes, and we could very simply get students to use the damper pedal to create a nice legato 5-note scale. For example, like this: lift off, lift off, and you can hear what I'm doing there is using the damper pedal to obviously hold those notes so that we get quite a nice legato phrase. Once you've done single notes like that, you can then get them to do triads. So once we've got this, using the damper pedal, you might be able to see my damper pedal working. Then we do triads. In both hands, so we do left hand as well. Now, of course, I'm playing this and it's all going fairly well, but of course, for a student, they probably won't get it right. And an important part of that is to say, well, why? What are you listening for there? We're listening for muddy sounds, where the damper pedal is held down perhaps for 2 different chords. We end up with, sort of too many notes being washed together, or we have breaks in sound where they don't pedal correctly. The damper pedal is not used. If you think about how we're using a damper pedal, it's actually really difficult to coordinate that damper pedal. So whatever you do when you're starting to teach damper pedal, don't have too much going on the keyboard, because to start with, it's like learning to drive a car. When you first start thinking about the gas pedal and the brake and how to use those 2 in combination, once you've been driving for a while, it's second nature. But when you start, there's a lot of mental activity there just on controlling the physical elements of a car, or in this case, the damper pedal. So keep it really simple with the keys, and lots of listening to the sound, because actually good pedaling comes with listening a lot of the time. And as I said, single notes and triads like that. I think just relating this back to the pieces, there's a lovely piece in your sample pack called Bluebird, which starts to use pedal around about, I think it's about grade 3. Can't quite remember, but it's a lovely piece. It's a great piece to learn pedal with, because it's all based upon triads in the left hand. That sort of, I'm probably making that up. That's probably not how Bluebird goes at all, but it's that sort of structure of the left hand accompaniment which is really, really appealing. So hopefully that's useful. A question from Roanna about scales. Well, when you play a scale in exam, do you need to play with a backing track? That's a really good question, and the answer is no. There are no backing tracks used for scales, no backing tracks used for pieces, no backing tracks used for sight reading for the classical exams. The only place we use backing tracks is for the optional improvisation interpretation exercise. Nowhere else. That's a little bit different, as I said, to the rock school syllabus. Okay. I think we've got time for one last message. Any keyboard requirement for debuts? That's a very good question. Connor, I think you'll be better placed to answer this one, but my understanding is that we don't specify the type of instrument too much. It can be a digital piano like this. It can be an acoustic piano. It can, in some cases, be a keyboard, where the keys are not weighted, that's often the choice, isn't it, of debut students. They can use that. And again, Connor, please feel free to jump in and correct me if I'm wrong here. The only thing I'd say is that don't forget that even for debut level, we are asking students to think about dynamics in their pieces. If their keyboard is not touch sensitive, and they can't develop that while they're practicing, then that could be reflected in their assessment. If they're not able to control dynamics because they haven't done so, that could be an issue. But if they have a touch sensitive keyboard with 61 keys, that's absolutely fine. Obviously, as they go through mid to higher grades, the uh, the what's the word? The compass, the width of the notes that we use. We actually do scale the whole of the 88. Well, not the whole, but a wide area of the piano for later grades. It could be that you're playing outside the regions of 61 notes in the higher grades. But for early grades, 61 keys is absolutely fine because we know for debut in grade one, the starting beginner students, they have instruments perhaps that are lower cost, quite naturally. So we're trying to accommodate that if we can.
That's wonderful, Chris. That's absolutely right. And I think from RSL perspective, we want to allow as many candidates and students as possible to access the classical piano. So we're not trying to be restrictive in what equipment those students can use. So that's spot on. I've noticed that there's a lot of questions about improvisation and support and resources for that. We do have, on our RSL news page, which I put in the links there, a lot of resources that are in there and a lot of hints and tips. It's also worth going to the RSL YouTube channel. There's a wealth of videos that you can look through that give you lots of support. Also, some really interesting stuff about preparing your students for the exams, to get rid of nerves and make sure they're comfortable and what to expect, particularly if you're doing them online these days as well. I want to thank you, Chris. That was incredibly informative.
You're welcome.
I've learned a lot this morning, and I think it's been very, very useful for everybody here.
Good.
If there are no more questions, feel free to. I will be staying on this for a few minutes afterwards. So if you do want to message away from the rest of the group, please feel free to do so. If not, you can always email us, and I will put that into the chat now. But also, there have been many of the local representatives on the webinar today as well. So I've seen people from Singapore, from Cambodia, from Malaysia, from Africa, Kenya even. So if you have any questions for your local representatives, please contact them directly. We do plan to host more of these, so I think next time we'll be looking at the higher grades further down the line where it gets a little bit more complicated. So please as well register your interest with that. We want to be able to produce quality like this regularly to be able to support you as best we can with the classical piano and other qualifications. Just for your own notice, coming up in the future, for your colleagues or if you're interested yourself, this September we'll be releasing classical violin for the first time, which will be very exciting, and also a brand new vocal syllabus, which I think is going to be very appealing to a lot of your students in the not too distant future. But for now, I would like to say once again, thank you very much, Chris, for your time today, and also thank you to everybody else for attending. Have a wonderful afternoon or morning, depending where you are right now. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.